Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello, welcome to the latest episode in our Equity Capital Markets podcast, focusing on all things ECM. Today I'm joined by Savan Gore, a partner in our Perth office, and by Rebecca Gilbert, an associate also in our Perth office. So welcome to you both. Our topic today is reverse takeovers. And actually, this is the last topic in our current series of podcasts. And maybe the natural place to start, Savan or Rebecca, is to define our terms. So what is meant by reverse takeover?
Thanks, John. I'll take that one. A reverse takeover is a transaction, whether by a takeover or a scheme of arrangement, that involves the bidder making an offer to acquire shares in a target company that's actually larger than the bidder. The bidder often offers its shares as consideration for the acquisition of the target, and then the target shareholders become shareholders in the bidder.
And takes a majority control. So control of the bidder effectively changes as a result of the transaction.
Yeah, that's correct.
And the other term we often hear we don't see them in practice that often, but obviously is backdoor listings. So I guess they're similar. What's the difference between a reverse takeover and a backdoor listing?
Yeah, look, I think people get confused by the terminology. A backdoor listing is actually, or it can be, a subset of a reverse takeover. So backdoor listing refers to the process where, an entity or a vendor with an asset or an existing entity, wants to operate that asset or entity through a listed vehicle. And so it seeks to achieve this by injecting that asset or entity into an existing listed entity rather than going through the more conventional process of undertaking an IPO. And so where you have a private entity, so unlisted, that then gets acquired by a listed entity, that is effectively a backdoor listing. So a reverse takeover may also be a backdoor listing if the larger company is not listed.
Right. Okay. And is that the most common situation where we see reverse takeovers with an unlisted bidder?
That is. There's obviously one at the moment which is quite prominent in the press, which is Sigma Health's reverse takeover of Chemist Warehouse. So Chemist Warehouse being a private public company, and Sigma Health being a listed a public company. And so Sigma will be acquiring, by way of scheme of arrangement, all of the shares in Chemist Warehouse. And then as a result, the two will be combined and there'll be one listed entity, which will include the Chemist Warehouse business. But the existing shareholders of Chemist Warehouse, the private entity, will end up holding, around 85% of the, I guess, call it merged group, and the existing Sigma shareholders only holding the remaining 15%. So clearly a reverse takeover.
And so the advantages of a reverse takeover, I guess, are similar to why people attempt backdoor listings, which is to achieve ASX listing without necessarily having to go through the traditional IPO path, which can take a fair bit of time and is subject to all kind of market risks along the way.
That's right. And look, I suppose that advantage is somewhat being eroded by the fact that in almost all cases, ASX will invariably require a company, a listed entity that's undertaking a backdoor listing, to recomply with chapters 1 and 2 of the listing rules. So those are your admission and quotation requirements. Because really the view is, if you couldn't achieve a listing by way of IPO, you shouldn't be able to go and do that through the back door. So, it is something that ASX has kind of cracked down on over the last several years. Otherwise, you can imagine people would just find, small listed shells and use as a way of circumventing having to go through the full IPO process.
Yeah, and so we often sort of talk about backdoor listings, but very few ever seem to be completed. And maybe the illusory benefit seems to be that you can take an existing listed entity with existing spread and you don't have to go through all that again. But from recollection, if your backdoor listing involves a significant capital raise, you still need to meet the spread requirements under the new raise. So even that advantage, so-called advantage, sort of disappears. So more often than not, it seems to be the case that it's actually better just to follow the traditional IPO path.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I mean, there's still potentially cost benefits because it might be slightly cheaper to, have an existing listed public entity, that is already listed. That could also mean that, things like underwriting fees and other, initial establishment costs are potentially less. It's potentially quicker, to go through an RTO process than have to go through a full IPO process. And there's also potentially, less volatility around pricing.
Yeah.
It might also be slightly less public scrutiny. You can imagine, full IPO process, a lot more public scrutiny, roadshows, marketing. An existing private company might prefer to sort of RTO because in a sense, you can sort of remain private for a little bit longer. It's more the existing listed entity that is sort of the front-facing public face of the transaction.
Yeah. We've sort of drifted into this a little bit, but Rebecca, also on that, are there any other advantages of the reverse takeover path?
Thanks, John. Some of the sort of advantages of a reverse takeover rather than that conventional IPO route allow a private company to go public without the requirement to raise capital, and also the ability to obtain waivers from the ASX for the issue of shares that don't have to comply with the minimum share price of 20 cents. So that can obviously make it a bit easier for them at that stage.
Yep.
I think we previously mentioned the ability to sort of utilize the share register of that listed company to satisfy the ASX spread requirements.
Yeah.
Rather than having to go out and find shareholders.
Yeah.
It can also be, depending on what, how ASX and ASIC treat the transaction, can be a shorter transaction time than an IPO. It could be, up to 3-4 months as opposed to maybe up to a year for an IPO.
Yeah.
And also,
so it can be a little bit more flexible, particularly for sort of smaller cap.
Smaller cap, yeah, definitely.
Lower share,
better suited.
Lower issue price, and that may be in a need to raise capital more quickly.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And what about disadvantages? What can be the downsides of a reverse takeover?
I think there can be like a bit of lack of interest from investors in this sort of structure rather than the IPO that, like Savan said, they get a lot of media attention. So that could be definitely be a disadvantage.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing to add there in terms of, disadvantages, there are potentially, additional approvals required. In a traditional IPO, you're just focusing on, the proposed private entity that will be listed. Where you have an existing listed entity that's looking at undertaking a reverse takeover, there are approvals that will be required both on the listed entity side and on the target side. And that's because, changes were made to the listing rules several years ago, which treat reverse takeovers differently to normal takeovers. And so the exceptions that would ordinarily apply, for example, to restrictions on your share placement capacity aren't available for a reverse takeover. And so at a minimum, you'll need to go to shareholders to get approval.
Right.
And that's at the sort of listed entity level. You'll need to go to shareholders to get approval to issue, shares in excess of your placement capacity. If it's a backdoor listing, then ASX is also going to most likely require you to get approval under Chapter 11 of the listing rules, and also to have to, re-go through the admission and quotation requirements. And then on the target side, if it's structured as a scheme of arrangement, well then there's a need for existing shareholders of the target to approve the transaction and for the courts to approve the transaction.
Yeah. And presumably that we most often see this where the effectively the target is an unlisted public company. Would that be right?
That's
Or
right. Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Because of course, if you're a public company, you're then subject to Chapter 6 of the Corps Act, and so the takeover restrictions apply.
Yeah.
And so you would need to then go through a formal takeover process.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. It's interesting, John, because sometimes what can happen is, as a result of the reverse takeover, an existing shareholder in the target could actually land up acquiring 20% or more of the bidder.
Yeah.
Now, there is usually an exception to the prohibition in Section 606 to that. However, ASIC and the takeovers panel, will scrutinise any transactions which have sort of been set up to pass control without existing shareholders of the bidder being able to actually, make a decision or approve that.
Sure. Yeah. And maybe Rebecca, any other legal issues that either bidder or target as listed companies would need to consider?
I think, like Savan said, the shareholder approval piece is really the key part. Like, the entity's still going to need to get approval regardless, so it sort of doesn't offer the benefits of going that route are sort of circumvented by requiring shareholder approval. Yeah. And again, with the re-compliance issues, which I think the Chemist Warehouse example is actually unique because the ASX have said that Sigma's not actually going to be required to satisfy those requirements. But again, they're subject to a number of other conditions, shareholder approval on both sides. But,
yeah. And so the status of that transaction, where has that got to now? Presumably notices of the meeting, expansion memorandums, prospectuses have been prepared and distributed.
I think it's still in that sort of stage where they're preparing everything. I don't think.
Yeah. Any other recent noteworthy examples of reverse takeovers that we should mention?
That's probably been the most prominent transaction of late, and I think there was a real flurry of reverse takeovers back in 2016-17. And that was sort of largely driven by the fact that a number of sort of shells on ASX, if they didn't do something, they were going to be delisted.
Yeah.
And so, I wonder whether, given how kind of quiet the IPO market has been, maybe more people will look at the reverse takeover as another means to get listed. So that's quite interesting. I mean, from a pure ECM perspective, of course, given the fact that, one will most likely need to recomply with chapters 1 and 2, there will often then have to be a fundraising that is undertaken in conjunction with the transaction, and that's usually in order to ensure that the assets test and the sort of minimum working capital requirements that ASX impose can be satisfied. So that, I guess, adds to the complexity, and I suppose adds another piece, but is a positive thing because it's an opportunity to sort of raise new funds.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, trend that we should keep an eye on. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks to you both. Thanks everyone for listening today and for tuning in to the series. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed today's episode, then please rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and see you next time.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.